Dead laptops and limited outlets, enhancing technology access in the classroom. One day during my 488 placement, my teacher tripped over a power cord. Afterwards, while we were talking, she told me that the issue is that we're using 2017 technology in a classroom designed in the 1990s. With Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we talk about how students' physiological needs need to be met before we can teach them. Well, that kind of got me to thinking, what about their technology needs? What are the base technology needs that need to be met before we can integrate technology into our teaching? How can we integrate technology into our teaching if our classroom limits the student access? I realized that our base technology need in the classroom really is students being able to use their devices when it's time for them to be used. Some of the common issues that I noticed through my observations are that student computers were often dead. They had no charge because students had been using them all day already. The classrooms have limited wall outlets, so students aren't necessarily able to plug their computer in because someone else has their computer plugged in. Sometimes there's an inability for most students to access outlets because the way the seating is designed. If they're sitting in the middle of the classroom, how can they use their computer and plug it into the wall? Students also sometimes end up having to share their computers when they're supposed to be working on independent work. I actually experienced this in one of my lessons where students were supposed to be taking a quiz, but only half the students could do it. Then the biggest issue that comes out of this is that class time gets eaten up trying to accommodate the student needs. Students are spending time walking around the room trying to find a plug instead of spending time working on their assignments. In order to address this issue, I came up with a 3-step solution for creating a technology-accessible classroom. This solution is designed for teachers to use starting at the beginning of a new school year. The first step of the process is finding your materials. So what you want to do is talk to people in your school or in your district to find out what materials are available to you that will allow your classroom to provide access to charging for your students. Some of the materials that you could find may be extension cords. It'd be cool if you can get an old charging cart, like the laptop charging carts that they have at most schools. Also, chargers for various types of devices, because sometimes students don't all have the same type of computer, even if it is a one-to-one school. The next step to the process is designing your classroom. You want to consider what solutions your materials provide, then implement them in classroom design. Obviously, you also want to keep in mind other aspects of your classroom, like what types of activities the students will be doing, how many students you have, what kind of design and setup really works best for you in your course. Some of the possible solutions that you could implement would be having a designated charging station, having charger access at all pods that you set up, and layouts that consider where outlets are in the room to make them more accessible to students. The last step for this solution is to create procedures and policies for your students. These need to be explicit to your students so that they know how and when they're supposed to access whatever you've set up in your classroom. They're highly variable depending on what solution you're able to procure, and they really have to be specific to your course and what works best for you as a teacher. Because of the general nature of this solution, I have created a few scenarios to consider. Our first scenario involves you having access to a charging cart that you can keep permanently in your classroom. You can see here from our seating arrangement that the students are sitting independently, they're not in groups, and there's plenty of space between the rows. The far left, it looks like a table, and we're going to say it's go ahead and say that it's a charging cart. And the big part about this process would be that this would be really procedure heavy. So the ones that I devise is that students come into the classroom and they all plug their computer into the charging station for the full 20 minutes of their SSR, silent sustained reading at the beginning of class. On days when they're using computers, the PowerPoint has a laptop icon in the bottom right corner. This means that immediately after SSR, students will get up, they'll walk over, they'll get their laptop, they'll go back to their desk and get their computer started. On days when technology is not being used, students can simply leave their computer charging for the entirety of class, which is great because if they have a class after years, their computer will hopefully be fully charged by the end of class. Our second scenario here is that you have limited access to outlets, but you have access to an unlimited number of extension cords. So the solution I came up with here is that students are sitting in groups. All the groups are stagnated so that they're about equidistant from the wall. And what you would do is you're going to lace up some cords and pretty much make it so that each pod has its own charging access. The difference with this compared to the last scenario is that this is a lot more student heavy. So students would have to be responsible for deciding if their computer needs to be charged, and they'd also be responsible for making sure that they have their own charger with them, because you won't be providing them with a charger, you'll just be providing them with an outlet. To make a kind of good solution for that issue, the issue of them not bringing them, I would say do a charger check maybe once a week so that students feel like they have to consistently be bringing their charger to class. Our last solution here is the one that I personally feel to be the least desirable. So you have barely any outlets in your room. Most of them are being used by teacher tech, like your smartboard and your computer. You can't have extension cords run across the room for safety reasons, but you have access to a collection of chargers for various devices. So with this solution, what I would do, they're in groups again, just because I personally like groups. And on that far left table that we see in the diagram, you would have just a charging station. This one, again, would have to be pretty procedure heavy and also would put a little bit of responsibility on the students. So you would have to maybe limit when students can go and charge their computers. I said if your computer's at 50% or higher, you don't need to plug it in. You're probably fine to go for class. When students do plug in their computers, they need to write their name on the board and make sure that they're only charging for 15 minutes if there's a queue. Obviously, if there's not a queue, it doesn't really hurt if they just leave their computer plugged in. And then students will be advised from day one of your class that your class is not the best place to charge their computer and that they should be coming to class with their computer charged, preferably. So maybe they can plug it in another class where they don't use computers as much. Maybe they're in the library before they come to your classroom. They just have more access to charging. But just making students aware that your classroom really does have limited accessibility for charging. Although those are just a few scenarios, the scenarios really are limitless, but so are the solutions, and it's really going to be based on you, your classroom, and your class needs. So even though this seems like a pretty basic concept, I really think that it's important to make sure that our students do have access to being able to just charge their devices. This basic technology need will save you class time in the long run and will allow you to use technology to the fullest extent.